Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our online lecture, 60 Years of Protecting Our Coast. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Becky. I'm one of the patrons managers here at the Trust, along with my colleagues Ash and Jen. I've had the pleasure of meeting some of you before in person, and it's really nice to be able to come together here this evening and hear from some of our experts at the Trust about our work on the coast. 2025 marks 60 years since the launch of the Neptune campaign to protect our nation's coastline. I know that many of you will have supported this campaign over the years, so thank you very much indeed. Over the next hour, we're going to hear from a range of our experts on the impact that our coastal work has had, and we're going to focus in on some specific examples too, as well as looking at what the future holds. The work completed and the progress made so far is only possible thanks to the generous support from people like yourselves, so a very sincere thank you. This evening we're going to hear from Helen Jay, our Senior National Consultant for Coast, Andrew Pode, who is the General Manager for the Farne Islands, Zoe Davies, who's a Project Manager in Wales, and Paul Forecast, the Regional Director for the Midlands and the East of England. You'll hear from each of our speakers, and there will then be a chance for a Q&A at the end. Please do submit any questions that you might have as we go along throughout the lecture using the Q&A button at the top of your screens, so you can just type questions in there. We'll gather these questions up and I'll pose them to our speakers at the end. A few very short bits of housekeeping. During the lecture, you won't be able to turn on your cameras or microphones. However, if you'd like to turn on captions, you can do so by pressing the CC button, which you'll be able to see at the top of your screens. I hope you enjoy what promises to be a really interesting hour, and I'll hand over now to our Senior National Consultant for Coast, Helen Jay. Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Becky, and thanks for everyone for joining us tonight. Next slide, please. So over the next hour, we'll transport you away from this dark November evening to some of our beautiful coastlines where the sun always shines, apart from maybe in Wales. And we'll tell you about some of the work that we're doing at our coast, which is only possible thanks to the support that you give us. Next slide, please. The National Trust now look after an incredible 896 miles of coast across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the photos here demonstrate the sheer diversity of sites we look after, from sweeping sandy bays to towering cliffs, and including iconic sites like the Giant's Causeway and heritage sites such as the Thin Coast in Cornwall, and even 11 lighthouses. Whilst much of this land sits above the reach of the tide, we also own areas of seabed and intertidal, including much of the incredible Stramford Loch in Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about our story about how we've got to the place of looking after around 10% of the coastline of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Well, the coast has always been at the heart of the National Trust. The very first gift of land was 4.5 acres of cliffland above Barmouth overlooking Cardigan Bay back in 1895, 130 years ago. This piece of land was donated by Fanny Talbot, shown here, who wished to secure the land for the public to enjoy, and in the custody of some society that will never vulgarise it or prevent wild nature from having its way, a message that really rings true to our cause today. And Octavia Hill wrote at the time, "We've got our first piece of property. I wonder if it will be the last." Well, it certainly wasn't. Next slide, please. Over the decades that followed, the National Trust acquired more tracts of land through further gifts and donations. But really by the 1960s, there was growing awareness of the threat to our coast from uncontrolled expansion of towns and villages and also industrial development. And this led the Trust to set up a campaign to raise public awareness of those risks and lobby government for better protection of our coastline. And a key part of this was seen to be taking coastal land into our ownership and care in order to safeguard it. Enterprise Neptune appeal was therefore launched in a fanfare of publicity in spring 1965. Its initial aim was to raise £2 million, which probably equates to about £41 million in today's money. And this was really to assist with that purchase of coastline. And Neptune has proven to be our most enduring campaign. Over £114 million has been raised to date, enabling a multitude of land purchases and projects. Next slide, please. But back in 1965, we really needed to know where we should focus our efforts. And so the Trust commissioned a piece of work to look at the scale of the threats to the coastline and identify those areas that needed saving. This was carried out by a lecturer from the University of Reading, Dr. John Whitto, and a group of 33 students. They set out in May 1965 to survey the whole coastline of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. With limited technology, they trekked around the coast, camping in tents and painstakingly colouring in hundreds of Ordnance Survey maps, such as the ones shown here for the North East coast. They characterised both the quality of the coast and also those potential threats. And John Whitto found from this work that a third of the total coastline was what he considered to be in pristine condition or pristine status, but in need of protection from encroaching development and over-tourism. And from this, he recommended that the Trust acquire 900 miles of coast, a total that we're very close to achieving today. Next slide, please. So from the first Neptune acquisition of Whitford Burrows on the Gower in South Wales, shown on the left here in 1965, to our more recent acquisition of a former golf course in Sandilands in East Anglia in 2020, we've used Neptune funds to help us bring more land into our care. Around 3/4 of those miles that we look after has been acquired through contributions via Neptune. But the purchase of Sandilands, that's shown here, demonstrates a slight shift in our focus in terms of what land we are looking to acquire. We've moved beyond just acquiring land that was mapped as pristine by John Whitto and his students. And this is partly because of the protections that are now in place along our coast that recognise its national and international importance. In 2014, the University of Leicester actually repeated John Whitto's work, albeit digitally, to try and understand how land along the coast had changed since that 1965 piece of work. And the data revealed that of the 3,442 miles of coastline deemed pristine in the original survey, 94% of it was now protected through ownership by the Trust or other environmental organisations or by statutory designations. Next slide, please. And in this slide, we can just see a couple of examples of coastline that we've acquired that weren't defined as pristine. On the left is a stretch of the County Durham coastline, specifically a place called Blass Beach, which was purchased in 1988. This area was deemed beyond redemption in the 1965 survey, and it was a coastline that was once black with coal waste. But it's since gone through a remarkable transformation through concerted efforts of a whole range of organisations, including the Trust and Durham County Council. And we now see a beautiful coastline there today for people to enjoy. The second photo shows the otherworldly landscape of Orford Ness in Suffolk. This was a former military testing site before it was sold to us by the MOD in the early 1990s, but I won't steal Paul's thunder. He'll be telling you much more about this amazing site later this evening. Next slide, please. And although acquisitions really do remain key to our work, we also use Neptune funds for a whole range of activities, from improving and maintaining access and paths, training new apprentice rangers, to seeding cliff-top wildflower meadows. And what you see here is actually a seed collector, not a leaf blower, which is what it looks like. We're also using technology to reach out to people in different ways. The top right photo shows some imagery produced for a site in North Wales called Dinistintla. This is an Iron Age fort located along a eroding stretch of coastline. And through us contributing to an EU project, Cherish, a whole range of work has been undertaken to try and understand the archaeological and the geomorphology of the site, and through that build up this picture of what the site would have looked like in the past. And this is now being used to engage with communities to talk about both past change and also future change and the change that we might see as a result of our changing climate. And the bottom right-hand photo is an incredible space that's recently been constructed on the South Tyneside coast, the Whitburn Coastal Conservation Centre. This now provides a really valuable place for people to come together and learn about nature and heritage on their coastline. Next slide, please. And Neptune funding is also used to help some of our larger transformational projects, such as salt marsh restoration at Northey Island in Essex, shown here on the left. Here we've been undertaking a project to retain, create and sustain salt marsh over the next 100 years, recognising that without this work, almost all of that salt marsh would be lost within the century. This is an area critical for its overwintering bird populations, and so it's incredibly important for us to try and sustain the supporting habitat for as long as possible. Money from Neptune and Delia's Fund has supplemented funding from other sources, such as the EU Life on the Edge project and even supporters in Belgium. Neptune funds are also used to support our adaptation work elsewhere, such as on the Purbeck coast, shown here in the right-hand photo, where we've recently removed failing defences and reinstated the natural slope behind. This will enable the coast to now naturally reach a more sustainable and resilient form, both creating a more attractive beach for visitors to enjoy, but also supporting a much wider array of species and habitats. Next slide, please. And so to the future. It will probably come as no surprise to you some of the challenges that we're facing. Rising sea levels, increased flood risk, changes in storm and rain patterns all have potential to directly impact our coast and the infrastructure located there. On the left is one of our cottages at Burnham Overystave in North Norfolk. And you might just make out the white brick halfway up the wall there. That shows the height the water reached during the 1953 storm surge event. Whilst defences are now in place to protect us against that, this really provides that useful reminder of the vulnerability of such low-lying areas, which will only increase due to sea level rise. The middle photo is Mullion Harbour in Cornwall. The original structure dates from the 1890s, and this was built to create a safe haven for fishermen on an otherwise treacherous coast. It now continues to support and protect a small community, but has required frequent repairs. Actually, since its original construction, repairs were needed. So at some point in the not too distant future, this will become economically beyond repair. So we're working closely with the community in this location to try and plan out that transition and what this coast might look like in the future. And on the right is Compton Bay on the Isle of Wight, where we have a combination of marine erosion and slope stability, resulting in really rapid change along this coastline. Here we've recently relocated the car park shown in this photo, but this is the type of risk and hazard we're facing elsewhere. Next slide, please. And it's not just our infrastructure, we're also seeing challenges for habitats and species along our coastline. Embankments prevent landward migration, which would naturally occur as a result of rising sea levels. And this is creating what we would call intertidal squeeze. So resulting in loss of habitats such as salt marsh, illustrated here at our site of Copthall in Essex. Squeeze of our beaches and intertidal areas also places increased pressure on some of our critical species. This can be either directly loss of a habitat or actually reducing that space available for species and humans to coexist, which means species such as the ring plover are experiencing increasing levels of disturbance. And expansion and development is still a threat to some of our areas, such as at Sandscale Halls in the northwest of England. Next slide, please. As well as pressures created by changes in our marine environment, we also face challenges from other climate-related issues. The photo here on the left is from our Purbeck estate a couple of years ago and shows the impact of a wildfire. Whilst most wildfires are started by humans, either deliberately or accidentally, research suggests that there will be a global increase of extreme fires by up to 50% by the end of the century. The right photo is Mount Stuart in Northern Ireland, and a key challenge we face here is from seawater intrusion due to rising water levels within Stramford Lough. This saltwater presents a threat to the world-famous gardens at this site, but we're making plans to enable us to adapt to this change. Next slide, please. But it's not all doom and gloom. I promised you sunshine, and I've given you a bit of gloom there. But we also know that the future presents us with opportunities, either working with change to restore habitats, such as at this site in Comaybe, which just demonstrates how quickly nature can be restored to an area if we allow it, or taking advantage of some of the new technologies, such as multi-terrain mobility scooters, shown here, which really enable more and more people to access our places and in different ways so we can connect more people with nature. Funding from Neptune critically helps us to proactively plan and address those future hazards. This might be through recording heritage that will be lost and sharing it with people in new and exciting ways, such as at Dinesclintla that I showed you earlier. Through buying more land that will create space for for nature and for people to move into, and create those connected corridors for nature to move through. It also allows us to adapt some of our sites, rolling back some of our infrastructure and assets where it's sensible to do so. Or even restoring sites in a more active way, such as the work that we're doing at Northey Island. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank you once again for all the support that you give us to help us in our work at the coast. And I'll now pass on to my colleagues who will talk in more detail about some of the work we're doing at 3 specific, really special coastal places. Firstly, we'll hear from Andrew, who will talk about our work in the far northeast of England, before we fly across to North Wales to learn from Dewi about the adaptation and restoration work we're doing at a place called Portland Line. Then finally, I'll pass to Paul, who will take you to Orford Ness on the East Coast and tell you more about this really magical place. Thank you very much. And over to you, Andrew. Sorry.
Thanks, Helen. And good evening, everybody. I'm Andrew Pode, our General Manager for the Farne Islands and Northumberland Coast. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you this evening about our Future Farnes project, which is a project that's just nearing the end of its first phase, and we're about to embark on the second. So if we can go to the first slide, please. So this is a view we're looking at here of Inner Farne, the Farne Islands, and it's taken last November, so we're not quite taking you away from the cold month of November, but we've got various poster boys and girls on the Farnes, and at this time of year it's our Atlantic grey seal colonies. So if you actually look in the bottom left hand corner of this image, and you can see some shapes on the beach there, that's our seal colony down there, and we're just at the start of welcoming what we hope will be about 3,000 Atlantic grey seals into the world. So our rangers are busy getting ready for that event, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is a slightly similar shot from slightly further out. What are the Farne Islands? They're a cluster of about 28 islands. I say about 28 because it depends where the tide is as to how many we have. And Inner Farne, which we're looking at here, is the closest to the mainland. It's about a mile from the mainland, and is the island that currently is accessed by our visitors, which we welcomed 41,000 this year, which is the highest number we've had. We've been steadily climbing again since we were closed for COVID and then avian flu. Beyond Inner Farne here, we can see, if you look over the top of the White Lighthouse, which is the active Trinity House lighthouse there, you can just make out Bamborough Castle on the mainland. And if you really squint hard over the other tower to the right of it, you can see the blip, which is Lindisfarne in the distance, Lindisfarne Castle, which is also in our care. I mention those sites because, you know, we talk an awful lot at the Farne Islands about the birds and the seals and the wildlife, which is obviously why it's a National Nature Reserve and largely why the National Trust have been there for 100 years now. But we're really keen moving forwards to start exploring some of those human histories. And of course, there are two historical figures who really stand out there. One is Grace Darling, the Victorian heroine who, with her father, rescued some of the shipwrecked people from the Forfarshire, which shipwrecked on the Farnes in the 1800s. And she lived in the lighthouse that was actually on Helen's shot on her last slide there at Longston, which is the furthest island out, which is about 4.5 miles from the mainland. And the other character is St. Cuthbert, who is an early medieval saint who lived on Inner Farne, amongst other places. He was a monk from Lindisfarne, an Anglian monk who we are very keen to explore more about, and he's an incredibly important saint. Since the Reformation, he's become quite forgotten about unless you visit Durham Cathedral, because Durham Cathedral is Cuthbert's shrine. He's buried under the altar. The whole cathedral was built in memory of St. Cuthbert. And this little island here is where he lived for a very long time, and he wanted to live. It's where he wanted to be. He was teased away from there at times to become bishop at Lindisfarne. So he lived here on his own, we're told. But where we think he lived, which is near the tower on the right, he had a clear view of Bamburgh Castle, which is where his king was, and he could also see Lindisfarne, where his bishop was. So he was never far from seats of power. But Inner Farne's never been excavated, so I'm going to come on to that in a bit about how we're starting to explore those stories a little bit more. But really keen to tease some of those human stories out. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are the real poster boys. Our puffins. Amongst the many seabirds we have on the islands, these are the ones that really draw the crowds. We sold our puffin pin badges this year, which we were the top selling pin badge in the country in our National Trust fundraising. We sold £13,000 worth of puffin pin badges. So they really do draw the crowds in, and it's fairly obvious why. But these are one of the many seabirds that are seriously under threat now through climate change. Our rangers, we have 14 rangers at the peak of the season on the islands. We have 5 full-time rangers, and then we swell those numbers in the summer with seasonals to help both manage the habitats on the islands, to help make it easier for species like puffins and Arctic terns to nest, but also to do the really important counting and the research. So this year we know our puffin numbers were down about 23%, which is down to about 35,000 pairs. It's not an exact science monitoring puffins. You have to stick your hand down puffin burrows and see what's down there. And when you can have up to 50,000 pairs, you're clearly not going to get them all. So what's really important is that we ensure that we can keep our teams on the islands and ensure we have that consistent long-term monitoring. Because also seabirds are really long-living species, but very low productivity. So they do weather the storms, both physical and metaphorical, and it's really important that we keep an eye on how these bird numbers at the moment are recovering from avian flu, which hit us in 2022 and 23, but also over a longer term, monitoring the impacts of climate change and impact on these species. So we very much see the Farne Islands as a barometer of that change. Next slide, please. So this year was our centenary in August. The islands have been in the care of the National Trust since 1925. It was an event we were really keen to mark as part of our Future Farnes project. It neatly marked the end of phase 1, which I'll talk about in a minute, and it was a really good way of kickstarting phase 2. The other aspect of the project is we're really keen to engage more people in our work on the islands, and using money from a legacy. We've got a communities and partnerships manager on the coast now, and she was able to work with the local schools and a local sand artist to create this image on the beach at Sea Houses overlooking the Farne Islands back in August. Which took an enormous amount of choreography, you can imagine, with primary school children and an artist and a load of rakes trying to create an image like this before the tide came in. So it's been a really special year for us this year, but it's a really good opportunity to think about the past, about the present, and very definitely about the future of the care of the islands. Next slide, please. So, what have we done so far with our Future Farms project? Phase 1 was largely funded by Neptune, and I do apologise now for the 3-letter acronyms in the text there, because I own up, I've pinched this slide from our project manager and I didn't check that. But the first picture there is where the MOD bit comes from. That's our buildings at Low Newton on the Northumberland coast, which is an RAF radar station that we've occupied since the early 90s. And one of the 2 big buildings there was the RAF's accommodation block, which really, since we took it on, had largely been used for storage. So one of our ongoing problems in recruiting our seasonal teams every year in the far northeast there is simply finding places for them to stay when they're not actually on the islands themselves. And the over-reliance on them being on the islands has caused numerous problems, particularly in recent times, especially with avian flu and COVID and such like. So we felt it was really important to provide them with decent mainland accommodation that could be effectively their main accommodation, and we would then rotate staff out there from there to the islands as and when required. We also have a seasonal team right next to Low Newton that monitor the Little Tern colony at the Long Nanny, and they've been sleeping in tents for the last few decades in the sand dunes doing their watch, so they now also have a solid roof over their head when needed as well. So that was opened in February this year. It's been a huge success. The Rangers themselves have clearly loved it, and it's been the easiest year yet to actually recruit a good team because we were able to offer that as part of the package. So that is definitely a huge success, and we're looking forward to making the most of that in years to come. The CMP is a conservation management plan, which was completed for the Farne Islands by Purcell Architects from Edinburgh. A conservation management plan captures our understanding of everything as we know it now on the islands, and it rates all the relative significances. So when we're thinking about the future and making changes and order of investment of funds and such like, that really helps us form that plan. So that was completed by August this year and is already starting to inform some of the work that we're doing there. And then the CCR, it's not Creedence Clearwater Revival or any 60s pop band like that. It's a conservation condition report, which we carry out on a periodic basis. So that is also being carried out through Purcell, and it identified some serious issues with the stained glass window on St Cuthbert's Chapel there. So the significance of that window is high. So already we've diverted funds this summer, which was fortunately a good summer, to get some scaffolding up and actually have that stained glass window restored. Next slide, please. So we clearly do loads of research around the birds, and we do research around the seals. So that archaeological research I mentioned before is part of the next phase, and we started last year and then continued this year working with Bradford University to carry out geophysical surveys of Inner Farne, which, as I say, apart from by the puffins, has never been excavated. And actually that grainy image on the top left there is a LiDAR image of Inner Farne, and all those pock marks at the left hand side, they are puffin burrows you can actually see on there. But then clearly you can make out the buildings in the center there. The bottom right there, we can see one of the team from Bradford carrying out the geophysical work last year. But this year we've really been at the cutting edge of geophysical work, because what we can't do is what that team member there is doing over puffin burrows. We can't walk over them. So we needed to find a way of carrying out more detailed geophysical work over those areas. So this year, it's only just been completed, so apologies, I haven't got any images of it yet, but we've used drones, and it's the first time we've used drones to carry out this sort of work, and it involved bringing specialist equipment in from Sweden. But the bottom left image there is the image from the life of Cuthbert that shows us how Cuthbert built his little cell on the island, which was clearly with the help of angels, but also some of his brothers. But unusually, for a period that used to be known as the Dark Ages, we have a very detailed description of what Cuthbert's cell looked like, both from the Venerable Bede, who was writing about him a few decades later, and also in the life of St. Cuthbert. And both of those accounts, you know, they're very similar to each other. So there's this detailed description of a circular structure. And so the work we've done this year has been concentrating on some of the areas around the chapel there. And, you know, we need to watch this space because they're still analysing the data, but there have been several what archaeologists like to call anomalies showing up that have got them quite excited. And it could be that it's already starting to make us think differently about how the islands may have been occupied in that time. And also in many of there's lots of trenches from the Napoleonic period possibly showing up. So it's a fascinating piece of the human history of the islands that we really didn't understand properly. The other bit around Farms 100 that we've done this year has been Puffin Cam, which you may have seen, that had over 300,000 views, which is a phenomenal engagement tool. We're really keen through the phase 2 to start exploring ways to give greater access to the islands. We are restricted in how many people we can have on the island, but clearly there are some people, for whatever reason, that will never be able to physically get there. So we're really keen to look at ways to enhance that. And Puffin Cam's been a real learning curve for us this year that we've learned an awful lot from. It has been hugely successful, and we fully intend to continue with that next year. We have the most followed Instagram account in the National Trust. People just can't resist puffins or anything that mentions them, but clearly we've also been featuring a lot of the work that our rangers do in those Instagram feeds. So it's clearly that's been generating a lot of interest. It's not just the wonderful images of birds and seals. It's people really genuinely seem to be interested in what work the rangers get up to and what life's like on the islands. Next slide, please. So that's a bit of a roundup, really, of sort of where we've been, where we are at the moment, and where we hope to get to. The big thing for the future is really around millions of pounds of investment in the buildings and the infrastructure on the islands, which are struggling now. So the feasibility work and surveys that Purcell Architects are doing for us are helping us build options in. We're working with local communities, with visitors, with our ranger teams themselves to understand the needs for the future. But it's a really difficult environment to work in. So with the money that we've got left from Neptune, next year we're going to be starting work on Brownsman Island, which is one of the islands that the Darling family lived on. There's a lighthouse building that our rangers use, but we need to start exploring methodologies. How do you get building materials onto the islands when you're doing major work and such like? So we're working closely with colleagues at the RSPB who have Coquet Island just down the coast and are a little bit ahead of us in that process. So that sort of partnership working is coming into it as well. But next year's the last tranche of the Neptune money that we have at the moment, and then once we've developed that forward plan, that will help us understand better what help we'll require further in the future. So that was it from me. I can't remember who I'm handing over to now. Is it Dewey? There we go.
It's me. Hello, and thank you, Andrew. That's quite an act to follow, but I'll try. So I'm Dewey Davis. I'm the project manager for Porthin Llan, one of the coastal sites in Wales, and many other coastal sites. I also cover catchments in Wales for my sins, but we don't have puffins, but I'll try my best to make a good show of Porthin Llan. So if we could have the next slide, please. So Porthyn Llain is a picture postcard fishing village and coastal landmark in northwest Wales, and it's one of the most visited sites on the Llŷn Peninsula. So it's the arm that sticks out of North Wales. It's got a rich history dating back to the Iron Age, serving over the centuries as an important fishing village, a busy harbour, a hub for shipbuilding, and a potential major port for the island crossing. And the entire village of Porthyn Llain was acquired by the National Trust from the Cefn Amlwch estate in 1994. So not with us for that long, but yeah. The harbour itself is sheltered by a headland called Trwyn Dyn Llain, which juts out into the north and provides shelter from all but the northeasterly wind. Next slide, please. So for centuries, Porthyn Llain was a small fishing village, famous for its herring industry. Its sheltered bay made it a safe haven for ships to seek shelter from storms. Until 1806, when Porthyn Llain was designated as a statutory harbour authority, considered as a strong contender to become the main ferry port for the mail route between London and Dublin. However, Holyhead was eventually chosen due to better road access provided by Thomas Telford's engineering developments, including the Menai Suspension Bridge and what's now the A5 onto Anglesey. So despite missing out on the ferry contract, Porthyn Llain became a busy port and a harbour of refuge in the 19th century, and the historic Tŷ Coch pub, originally a vicarage, was converted into a pub in 1842 to serve the hungry and thirsty workers on the beach. And so today, Porthyn Llain has many designations and is protected as a registered historic landscape. Has a Grade 2 listed building, the Whitehall, is a national landscape, so the old AONBs. It's a special area of conservation due to the seagrass beds and a site of special scientific interest and an environmentally sensitive area, so plenty of designations there. Next slide, please. So coastal slips occurred behind the corner house in Porthyn Llain in 2015 and 2016, and the National Trust have been undertaking slope stabilisation works with partners, which involve drainage, pinning and mesh installation. And 2 pieces of cliff stabilisation work have been undertaken since 2017, when a partial landslip gave cause for concern for the villagers. So it's a problem that's not going away. Slide 4, please. The cottages and the famous Tŷ Coch Inn, the pub at Porthyn Llain, stand on the front line of climate change, and the properties have periodically flooded over the last 40 years, and the village is at significant risk from sea level rise and the increased frequency of storm events. Modelling flood scenarios indicate that 35% of the dwellings in the village are at a high risk of flooding in a 1 in 20 year storm event, and another 55% are at medium risk. So the image on the left shows the pub during the high tide or storm surge event. And there's other images showing the resilience work, so the higher walls and the demountable floodboards. And other work includes grouting of rock revetments and tougher windows and shutters, and as well as improved drainage valves. To date, the resilience work has cost around £350,000 and aims to provide resilience for Porthyn Llain up to the end of Epoch 2, which is around 2055. Next slide, please. So we don't have puffins, but we have seagrass. Porthyn Llain is a very important site for Wales' seagrass, one of the most, if not the important site. And the Zostem marina is the main species we have there. We work with Project Seagrass, including the universities of Swansea, Cardiff and Edinburgh, to monitor seagrass and use Porthyn Llain as a donor site for numerous other sites in Wales, including recently a successful reintroduction at Holyhead Harbour, so we obviously don't hold any grudges there with our rival port. Seagrass is a habitat that needs urgent restoration on a large scale, and this vital habitat provides many benefits for people and nature. But the UK has lost up to 92% of its meadows in the last century. Seagrass provides a natural defence, so their long leaves and dense network of roots. Seagrass is effective at slowing down water currents, dampening the effect of waves and trapping mud and sand, thereby stabilising the seabed and helping to reduce coastal erosion. Seagrass is a nutrient sink, so they absorb nutrients and chemicals from coastal runoff. And overabundance of nutrients and chemicals can lead to algal blooms that impair water quality and damage seagrasses as well as other marine life. And a single hectare can harbour up to 80,000 fish and provides an important nursery habitat for commercial species too. So every hectare of seagrass meadow will store approximately 830 metric tonnes of carbon, which is 40 times more than land-based woodland creation. So it's pretty important. Next slide, please. Even in Porthinllaen, seagrass faces many threats. So the images here show vehicle and vessel damage, also damage to the seagrass meadows from scouring from the moorings and low tide compaction. Next slide, please. So there's top left, there's an image of the seagrass itself with some seeds. Bottom left is a diagram of the flexible mooring system. So not your chain scouring the seabed, but a rope that sort of floats in the sea. And bottom right, another means of managing the site is a guide showing, so education, a guide showing speed restrictions for vessels and agreed vehicle launch zones, which has been quite effective. Over the past few years, we've been trialling an alternative mooring system in the inner harbour, including safe mooring systems. So this involves a large buoy and a flexible rope. And we've also replaced anchor chains with block and rope riser systems. So there's a limited damage to the seabed, which limits the scour. We're also looking at using helical anchors for the outer moorings at Porthinllaen for both recreational vessels and fishermen. Next slide, please. Another piece of work going on at Porthinllaen is the legal review. So we are reviewing and updating our powers as a statutory harbour authority, so the SHA in Porthinllaen. Being an 1806 Act, it's pretty out of date currently, so we're going to have to update it. But with jurisdiction of the Bay, National Trust Cymru has the unique opportunity to use the learnings from the trials of alternative mooring systems and the experience and skills developed through our seagrass work to create the UK's first truly sustainable harbour, and also help to shape harbour management elsewhere across the Trust. Next slide, please. And that's it from me, short and sweet, really. So I think I hand over to Paul now. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people joining us today. My name is Paul Forecast. I'm the Regional Director for the National Trust in the Midlands and East. And in terms of the coastal area I cover from Lincolnshire down to the Essex coast. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to transport you from the Welsh coast, and I want you to imagine a place where the air smells of salt marsh and wild herbs, and the only sound you hear really the kind of crash of shingle and the sort of loud call of gulls. But it's a landscape that's dominated by the monolithic ghosts of the Cold War. Located on the Suffolk coast, Orford Ness is often called the Island of Secrets, and for the best part of a century, British and American scientists and engineers carried out some of the most critical and dangerous experiments that have shaped kind of the modern sort of warfare in the 20th century. Today, it's something very different. It's owned by the National Trust as a National Nature Reserve. And in the next 10 minutes, I want to take you on a journey and explore four things, really. So one is about the geology of the place. Secondly, its role in that sort of scientific battlefield. Third thing is around how it's now being kind of converted to a nature reserve. And lastly, how the work at Orford Ness is shaping some of the work that we do both today and into the future. So you take to the next slide, please. To understand Orford Ness, you really have to understand its geography. It's the largest vegetated shingle in the whole of Europe. It's a 10-mile strip that's not shaped by humans, but shaped by the relentless kind of whirring of the sea that creates this thing called longshore drift, which moves sediment and pebbles along into a kind of long sort of elongated peninsula. And that then sort of diverts the rivers that sort of sit behind it and create things like salt marsh. And it's because of this kind of enclosed area, this was something that was first attractive to the military that was sort of based here. And the secret history really starts in the period of the First World War. So during 2015, the Royal Flying Corps, which would eventually become the RAF, came to Orford Ness in order to test some of the early sort of experiments around air-based warfare. So they tested combat tactics, bombs, gun sights, and even sort of tested things like sort of bomb ballistics. But some of the most crucial bits of experimentation really took place in the Second World War. So during that time, a gentleman called Robert Watson Watt tested what was known as radio direction finding, RDF. We know it today as radar, and it was the first time that anybody had sort of experimented with this, and it was the first place that Churchill saw that kind of blip on a screen, which was absolutely critical in terms of some of the things that we covered during the sort of Battle of Britain. By the time the Second World War, it really sort of proven itself as a sort of place where you could come and do experimentation, which took it into a kind of much more sinister period. So take me to the next slide, please. So the true ghosts of Orford Ness belong to the Cold War of the 1950s. And during that time, the organisation called the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment took over the site. And the legacy of that stands today in the form of these kind of deeply unsettling, what we call the pagodas. These are not decorative temples. These are laboratories which have 3-metre wide walls that kind of in a sort of protect kind of from sort of detonation. But interestingly, they have a kind of very delicate roof, and the design of these was that if they had a problem with the experiments that they were doing, that basically the blast would come up through the roof and would contain it, and in effect kind of protect the people that were doing the experiments next door. Next slide, please. So this was really important work, and the most critical piece of work that they did is that they tested some of the kind of essential elements of Britain's first nuclear bomb, what's known as the Blue Danube. And the crucial thing to say here is they weren't testing the nuclear weapons themselves, because obviously a kind of an experiment like that would be incredibly dangerous, particularly close to a village. But what they were testing is the detonators that would in effect trigger that sort of nuclear reaction. And they had various kind of different sort of laboratories there that would test vibration, shock, heat, cold. And the early nuclear bombs were carried not by submarines as they are today. They were carried in Vulcan bombers, and obviously it was essential if you were in a Vulcan bomber and you know the nuclear weapon that was kind of contained within, you know, that didn't sort of go off as you were sort of flying it around. So these were kind of really critical kind of parts to the work that they were doing. Next slide, please. The National Trust has over 1 million items in its collection, and most of those you would probably know as things like vases and paintings and many of the other things. But probably one of the most unusual things in our collection is the one that's shown in the bottom of this picture, which is an atomic bomb. And I should stress to everybody on this call that it is not functional, it's not working. But perhaps what should worry you is the way that we got hold of that is our countryside manager of the time simply contacted the MOD and said, you know, that we're running Orford Ness, and would they mind sending one over, which they duly did. So I'm not sure what that says about our sort of national security, but it's a nice thing to have. So take us to the next slide. So in 1983, the National Trust acquired Orford Ness, and it's designated a National Nature Reserve. It's probably one of the most designated places in the whole of the country. It's a special protection area, it's a special area for conservation, it's SSSI, it's a Ramsar, but it's also really important for its kind of heritage. And it's a place that you can see that real juxtaposition where you have sort of this incredible nature living alongside this kind of military plast. And one of the things that we're wrestling with at Orford Ness is the buildings that you see there weren't designed to last forever. They were designed to sort of perform a function for a very short period of time. And as a result of that, they are sort of quickly and very successfully kind of eroding away, particularly because it's on the sort of North Sea coast. And what we're doing is a thing called curated decay, where we're accepting that over time these things will be sort of taken by the environment, and we're thinking about how we kind of record those things into posterity. But we're also remembering that, particularly at a sort of time where we want to do more for nature, that it's a really important place for nature. So that vegetated shingle is incredibly important. It includes things like sort of very sort of rare things like sea kale and sort of sea poppy and very sort of rare plants that sort of live in a very sort of testing environment. But also the salt marsh is incredibly good for wildlife. So things like avocets, Chinese water deer, hares are all sort of very prevalent there, and there's a very large kind of colony of grey seals. And as I say, that ties into our new strategy, which is all about sort of increasing the amount of nature. Next slide. Another important aspect of our new strategy is also about how we sort of provide access to people that are currently underserved in terms of their access to nature, history and beauty. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do you get people across to a pretty inaccessible place? And one of the things that we purchased recently is this boat, which allows particularly those people that have got mobility difficulties to be able to come and appreciate and enjoy Orford Ness. Next slide, please. But the other thing that we've been thinking about is how do you inspire people about the work that we do? And obviously we do a lot around sort of people coming and visiting places like Orford Ness and many of our other coastal sites. But many people want to explore and sort of discover the coast in different ways. And one of the things that we've been doing at Orford Ness is a lot around art. So one of the pictures on the left-hand side is designed by an artist called Alice Channer. She's taken inspiration from the fact that Orford Ness is kind of covered in places like brambles, and she's kind of sort of depicting kind of through this kind of aluminium sculpture just how bramble is taking over some of the old buildings and sort of recognizing that nature ultimately will kind of have its own way. Another person that's incredibly inspired by is Robert Macfarlane. He's probably the preeminent writer of natural history of our time. He's a professor of creative writing at Cambridge University, and he's written a book called Ness, which is a kind of mixture of kind of poetry, observation. It's almost like a ghost story, which is really about sort of evoking kind of what is special about sort of Orford Ness. And every year, as a lecturer at Cambridge University, he brings students across who feel incredibly inspired by what they see, and they do their own sort of creative writing. Next slide, please. So why is it important that we have sort of creative ways of exciting people about Orford Ness? Well, very often it's a really good way of helping people think about and relate to some of the kind of issues of our time. So take climate change. One of the most famous features on Orford Ness is the lighthouse, or I should say it probably was the most famous feature on Orford Ness was the lighthouse, because as a result of climate change, this famous monument has now been sort of removed and taken down. But it's worth remembering that Orford Ness is a place of constant change. It's actually the third lighthouse that's existed at Orford Ness, and it's a demonstration that the power of the sea, the power of that sort of movement is constantly around us. And I think that's evoked, if you go to the next slide, in this lovely quote that comes from Robert Macfarlane's book, which is "Time is only ever overlapping, tumbling versions of the now." And that in some respects kind of relates to a lot of what we're trying to do on the coast, which is dealing with something that is not something static, but is constantly sort of changing and evolving. Last slide. So to summarise, Orford Ness is a unique living contradiction. It's a sanctuary for wildlife built in the ashes of human conflict. It's a place of incredibly profound atmosphere and a landscape that allows you to stand face to face with that kind of history of the Cold War, which particularly at the times that we've got now sort of feels really sort of pertinent and salient. And it's kind of that sort of sense of, you know, that ultimately for all of the things that we do, nature will ultimately kind of take over and have its way with it. So it will ultimately have that sort of final word. So thank you for listening. I'll hand back to Becky.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you very much to all our speakers, Paul, Derry, Andrew and Helen. Thank you very much indeed. We've covered so many different areas, diverse areas of our coastal work, and I've certainly learned a great deal. I hope our audience listening at home really enjoyed that too, and that we were able to share with you some hopefully new aspects of our work and give you that greater insight. We do have time for questions now. I think there are some questions that have come in. Let me just have a quick look. And you are welcome to post any new questions. We'll pick those up now. So the first question says, is the National Trust acquiring any new bits of coast? So perhaps Paul, if you'd like, would you be okay to have a look at that one? Is the National Trust acquiring any new bits of coast, is the question.
Yeah, very much so. In the east of England, it's probably the place that is most impacted by climate change. So it's got a very sort of low-lying, soft coastline, and it's also sinking into the sea. So at the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago, it kind of almost pivoted the sort of the southeast of the country up into the air, and as the sort of ice has retreated, it's slowly dipping down as sea level is rising. So one of the things that we're sort of constantly thinking about is that many of the habitats, particularly on the East Coast, are really important for nature, but they are incredibly vulnerable to being lost, and particularly wetland habitats that sit behind the coast. So very often you've got kind of the sea, but behind it you've got kind of freshwater habitats. And therefore one of the things that we're always thinking about is how do we sort of adapt to that? So in some instances we're probably going to have to let the sea in and create salt marsh, but we're then also going to need to think about those freshwater habitats. How do we go about sort of replacing those and sort of moving them sort of further inland? So we're always looking at that. The other thing that I'm really interested in, particularly on the East Coast, is that we do buy a lot of coast, which is particularly kind of pertinent to our sort of ambitions around nature. But I'm also interested about the sort of cultural legacy. So for instance, we don't own any buildings that are particularly about visits to the seaside. You know, would that be a good thing to do? We don't have many things that reflect the history of fishing. You know, again, are there opportunities for us to think differently and sort of present our sort of work in a very different way? And I think the coast is a really sort of good way of doing that. And then lastly, we know for a fact that, you know, many people, in terms of their access to the outdoors, going on holiday and going to the seaside is a really important aspect of that. So thinking about how we might acquire new places that give more access, particularly those that might be sort of unable to access it at the current time. So yeah, that's what we're planning to do.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. The next question sort of leads on from this one. So it's asking who owns the land that you would want to buy, and how would you purchase it? How do you purchase it? Perhaps Helen, would that one be okay for you to answer?
Yep, we have across England, Wales and Northern Ireland quite a diverse pattern of land ownership. We have land that's held by private landowners. We also have quite a lot of land which is held publicly by organisations such as Environment Agency, NRW, local authorities. I suppose, and then we have sort of a mixture of very small parcels of land, of individual farmsteads, and even just individual fields at times, to very large estates. So in terms of sort of the land that we look at, as Paul was alluding to, there's sort of different reasons why we might look to acquire land. We quite often look for land that's adjoining to ours, so that's either inland, so thinking about that sort of rollback, but also sort of thinking about longshore connectivity for both nature and people. So we'll quite often look at landowners surrounding our current portfolios. But we're also increasingly recognising that we can't do this alone, and we don't have to do it alone. There's a number of organisations out there that we can partner with, those that have land themselves, or we can combine to bring together a combined force for nature, I suppose, and think about how we could best acquire land in the future. Sometimes we will approach individuals if we see there's a particular area that we would like to expand into. Otherwise, we quite often wait for land to come onto the open market, or if we're lucky, hear about it before it comes onto the open market. So there's a range of different ways we look at acquiring land, and a range of different people that we would look to acquire it from.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you. The next question is, will be one for Andrew, I think. So how do you deal with bird diseases on the Farne Islands, like the flu that you mentioned?
Well, the first thing to say, I suppose, is when the bird disease arrives, as it did in 2022, there's very little we can do to stop that. But I guess once it's there, it's very much about working with the statutory agencies around learning about the mitigation measures, how we protect our staff, volunteers, and etc. But I suppose we're living it with it now. And when these diseases have become endemic, I mean, avian flu specifically there are some cases of it passing to humans, but seabirds carry lots of diseases, that some of which are far more harmful to us or to the seals, for example, than avian flu is. So really, it's about good biosecurity. So I think somebody may have mentioned earlier some of the foot baths and things that are put. So when you get off the boat onto the island, you have to go through a foot bath. We managed this year to get foot baths actually on the harbour, so you're going through a foot bath before you've even got onto the boat. And we're just continually being vigilant around biosecurity. If the birds bring the diseases in themselves from they've caught it themselves, there's very little we can do apart from follow guidance from DEFRA in ways that our teams can safely help mitigate. I don't know if that answers the question fully enough.
Thank you very much. I think that was great. Thank you, Andrew. The next question is from Louise. Hi, Louise. She says, thanks for the talk. You mentioned 11 NT lighthouses. Are they all in the NT guidebook? Not sure all the 50 odd NT pubs are in the guidebook. Who would like to take that one? Helen, I can see you've come off mute. Would you like to try that one?
Yeah, I'm not too sure whether they are all in the guidebook. There is a useful link that I can send your way as to ones that you can visit. There are certainly a number that you can arrange to visit, so we can maybe share that link in the Q&A bit, or wherever we can.
Yep, certainly. I can send that on. I can send that on afterwards as well. Thank you. The next question is, what does Ness mean? So like Orford Ness, is it in the same sense as Loch Ness? Paul, would you like to take that one for us?
Well, I know what it means at Orford Ness. I don't know what it means at Loch Ness. It's a really good question. So Ness in this context usually means a kind of promontory or headland. So you have this place like Cape Ness and stuff like that. But what I can recommend, which links back to my talk, Robert Macfarlane wrote a fantastic book called Landmarks. And the book is about kind of different terminology and use of words in the countryside. So he kind of got about 600 ways of describing rain in Northumberland and stuff like that. It's a really good book in terms of reference. So I don't know the answer about Loch Ness. I will come back to that. But yeah, in this sense, it's that. And the other thing is it's quite interesting in sort of places like Essex and Suffolk. You get a lot of that. So one of the other places that's kind of further down the coast from Orford Ness is a place called Sutton Hoo, and Hoo means peninsula as well. And Sutton Hoo is the place where a king was sort of buried in the 6th century in the sort of famous kind of helmet that's kind of in the British Museum. And I kind of love all that. I love all the kind of different kind of words and stuff like that. But I probably need to gen up on what it means north of the border, I think.
I think it might relate to the river. I think there's a
river,
Ness, Loch Ness. But yes, generally in English. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think it's the anglicised version of Nish, which is the river Nish Loch, and then Inver is the mouth of the Nish. So it's a Gaelic word that the English mapmakers have used. The most English word they can think of that sounded like it, which was Ness, I think.
Thank you very much. So we have a few more questions. The next one is, how do you decide what to prioritise when there's so much work to be done? Which is a great question. Helen, would you like to take that one?
Oh, I was sort of hoping you'd look to someone else. It is a challenge for us, and we did do a piece of work a few years back, specifically to look at risks posed by coastal erosion and tidal flooding. So that's just one element of everything we need to look at, but it did give us an indication of which properties we were expecting to experience the greatest threats or change, and which properties we needed to start thinking about earlier than others. So that piece of work was done a while back, but provided sort of a list of, I think it was around 90 sites at the time, of where we needed to prioritise actions. I think the challenges at the coast everywhere changes. It might change at different rates, but we do have certain sections which you might get a few bits of rockfall happen, but actually that's the critical bit of the coast because it's got the coastal path on, whereas elsewhere a bigger amount of change might not be as dramatic or as impactful. So it is a challenge for us. We do sort of do have this mechanism to sort of look at those different risks, different hazards. I think it's also around sort of looking at opportunities as well and thinking about where can we make the best gains for those different parts of the strategy, be that access, inspiring millions, around restoring nature. And certainly sort of as part of our new strategy, we are defining which properties we need to focus those different elements within. So yeah, I don't know whether Paul, you want to say any more with regards to the strategy direction on that.
Well, I think in some respects, the call that we're on, I think, is a really good example of kind of how you think about this. So I always take the sort of view that, you know, as an organisation, we're trying to save the world. So therefore, the to-do list is always more than you can kind of physically kind of do. But I think if you kind of look at the talk we've had today, which is the first bit of land we bought was by the coast in Wales, and then we've had Neptune. I think it's often you kind of worry about the priorities of the present, but you actually kind of forget how far you've come. And I think it's through things like Neptune and the sort of generosity of kind of individuals and sort of working with partners and stuff like that, you can get more done. So I tend to have a sort of view that the priority is probably around sort of engaging more people to sort of engage with these areas of work. And I think there's always a kind of way of getting things done. I think it's always kind of interested in that regard. So yeah, no, I'm an optimist. Yeah. Going to save the world.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Helen. I think we've just got time for these last two questions. So the next one is, how do you manage the peak times at some of the popular coastal areas? And they give Cornwall as an example. Dewi, Andrew, I wonder if you might like to take this one with your regions in mind.
Sorry, Andrew, did you want to go? Or
I can do, yeah. I mean, I did mention with on the Farne Islands, because we're a national nature reserve, we're actually restricted, and we have a maximum of 200 people that we can have on in a farm at any one time. So we work with the boat companies around an annual license and a timetable for them to ensure that we never exceed that limit. So it's cheating in some way, because on an island it's a bit easier to control those numbers. On the mainland for us in Northumberland, it's not as great an issue perhaps as it is in the busier parts of the country. So Dewi might be better to speak. In
terms of Porthain Llaen as a case example, really, it's kind of self-limited by the accessibility of that part of Wales. So we're quite fortunate in that respect. It's on the tip of the Llyn Peninsula, so that helps us. And again, it's quite self-limiting in terms of the capacity of car parking and that kind of thing, and the transport that people use to get to these places is quite limiting in that sense. Yeah, but we expect it. You know, we expect places to become busy, so we staff it accordingly, I suppose. one simple way of answering that. Also working with partners, as you know, to echo what Helen was saying, we do nothing in isolation, because we've got lots of people that can help us and need our help as well.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Yeah, I was
sorry,
just going to add to that as well, if you don't mind. Sorry to interrupt. It's an element we're very conscious of at the Trust. We obviously have some large car parks at the coast, and we have to sort of balance the needs of visitors against the needs of local communities and impacts on local communities, as well as the impacts on some of our really sensitive sites. So we do a lot of work with partners around sort of recreational disturbance and how we can influence people's behaviour at the coast, and maybe open up areas to sort of spread the load, I suppose, in places. So if we can, rather than concentrating people along a single coastal path, we're increasingly trying to open more land up within that coastal margin, so to create a much wider coastal margin where we can, so we can spread people out across a site and therefore sort of minimise that impact. At some of our sites, we're also trying to explore more and more around active travel options. So how can we bring people to site in a different way? And then once they're on the site, how can we move people around a site? Because some of our sites have got some amazing elements to them that people don't see, or they don't get to see. We've got some coastal sites where people will immediately just go to the beach. That's great, but there's so much more to the site that they could be enjoying. So it's trying to explain as well all the different elements that a site can offer people. So active travel, moving people around the site in a different way, and also spreading that load.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. There's one final question which I'll just squeeze in, which is perhaps, or you could take this one. Will coastal erosion cause the National Trust a problem, as land will be lost and coast path lost? So can you buy land inland to compensate for this? From Louise.
So yes, I think we definitely sort of, so one of the things that we're always looking at is trying to sort of model what will happen to the coast over time. So we've got some kind of really, you know, clever people that can understand kind of how sea level rise will sort of impact on different places, and there will definitely be, as I was saying earlier on, there'll be some habitats that can't endure being as close to the sea. They will need to move inland. But there's also an opportunity, and you saw in Helen's presentation earlier on, a place called Northey Island in Essex, and this is a place that's kind of under a lot of threat, but actually nature provides an opportunity as well. So very often around these coasts there's like hard defences, kind of concrete and stuff like that, and in effect, when you put concrete in, you can't keep pace with sea level rise. But one thing that can keep pace with sea level rise is salt marsh. So salt marsh, if you sort of establish it in the right way, can accrete and sort of grow and sort of provide a natural barrier, which provides a kind of win-win. You know, putting in concrete defences is incredibly expensive, and by having something that's adapting to the climate as it's changing, and also providing fantastic recreational and nature spaces, is a really amazing thing. So very often we kind of sort of see these things in conflict, but I think nature provides an incredible opportunity to sort of think very differently about how our relationship with the sea and relationship with climate change going forward, which is exciting.
And can I just add to that as well? Sorry, Becky, just before you try not to interrupt you this time. I think with specific reference to the coastal path as well, we've obviously in England got a nearly completed path around the whole of England. Wales were ahead of us, they've already got theirs, but a real benefit with how Natural England have been defining that coastal path is that where they recognise that change is likely to happen in the future, they have built in a rollback mechanism, which doesn't guarantee that land can be used for the coastal path, but makes it a lot easier mechanism for a coastal path to roll inland as coastal change occurs. So again, we sort of feed into that work with Natural England to sort of as Paul said, trying to understand how the coast will change in the future and be more proactive about planning for that change, rather than the path is lost and you suddenly have to scramble around for an alternative route. So.
Thank you very much, Helen and Paul. That draws our Q&A to a close. There's just a lovely final comment that says thank you for an engaging presentation. Loved hearing about all the work, and of course the puffins. The puffins got another mention. I'd like to say a final very big thank you to our speakers this evening. Thank you very much for your time, for your sharing your extensive knowledge and your expertise with us. It's really been fascinating, and thank you for answering the questions as well. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for your questions. I hope you found it informative, interesting and inspiring. And thank you once again for everything that you do to support the National Trust. We simply couldn't do this breadth of work without you, and your support is so valued.